Good morning, everybody. Excellent. Thank you all for joining us today for this important event. Thanks to those of you who are here in the room. Thanks to those of you who are watching this live via the live stream. And thanks to everybody who will watch the video of this event at some point in the future. I'm Michael Strain. I'm the Director of Economic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm very happy to welcome all of you today. Critics contend that the current policies and regulations for building physical infrastructure in the United States are too time-consuming, limiting both public and private investment, and hindering projects aiming to produce and deliver energy in particular. While congressional interest in potential permitting reforms frequently focuses on the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, NEPA is just one of many federal, state, local, and tribal permitting requirements. Understanding whether and how changes to parts of the permitting process would affect infrastructure investment is critical to supporting informed debates over the trade-offs inherent in any proposed changes. This issue is economically important and technically complex. It crosses academic disciplines, and because of this complexity, it is understudied by economists and by scholars of public policy. It is also an issue that is sometimes overlooked by policymakers, which hinders the success of new policies and new initiatives. This morning, we will have two expert panels that will discuss permitted-related policy options and their potential impact on investment productivity and economic growth. President Trump just yesterday made some changes to these regulations through executive orders, and we will get into that as well. So the run of show for this conference is straightforward. The first panel will discuss policy options for changing permitting requirements for physical infrastructure, and the panelists are here on the stage. The second panel will discuss how changes in permitting requirements for physical infrastructure might affect the U.S. economy. We welcome your questions. Those of you who are in the room will have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask questions. Those of you who are watching the live stream can submit your questions to my colleague, John Toohey. You can reach him via email at john.toohey@aei.org. The spelling of that email address is on the webpage for this event. You can also submit your questions on X using the hashtag #AskAEIEcon. Please remember to keep your questions short, and the statement that you make should at least nominally or ostensibly end in a question mark and not a period or exclamation point. The moderators for these panels will introduce the panelists. I will introduce the moderators. James Coleman, who is on the stage, is a law professor at the University of Minnesota and a non-resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. He practiced law at Sidney Austin in Washington, clerked for Judge Colleton on the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and was educated at Harvard. I have in my notes that he has a Central Asian butterfly named after him, and so that's obviously something we'll want to get into. I assume that's not a practical joke that's here in the notes. And Heidi Williams will lead the second panel. Heidi is the Orville E. Dreyfus Professor in Economics and Public Affairs at Dartmouth College. She is the lead editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which has been my favorite academic journal ever since I became a student of economics. Heidi co-directs the Innovation Policy Working Group at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and she works part-time at the Congressional Budget Office, including supporting their permitting related work. So there you have it. It's going to be a great conference. Thanks again to everybody who's tuning in, either in person on the live stream, and thanks to everybody who will watch the video later. And James, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be here today at a critical time for the future of American infrastructure. And we know that there has been a lot of variation, a lot of back and forth in American energy policy, but one point of common ground between the both parties, between a lot of advocates who have different opinions on energy, is that going forward, we are going to need a lot more energy infrastructure. And so that means receiving permission, so permits, for a huge variety of new projects, whether that is new power lines to support renewable energy, new pipelines to support the oil and gas industry, or new pipelines to support new zero carbon or low carbon industries like carbon capture, like hydrogen. And so whether you're talking about liquefied natural gas exports, nuclear, geothermal, any of those ideas, whichever you're excited about, that means you need to talk about permitting, because the United States, in many ways, has continued to run on infrastructure that is mostly built before 1970, when our modern permitting system went into place. And so I think there's common agreement that we're now at a moment where we need to build new infrastructure, whether the goal is to replace some of that old higher carbon infrastructure, or whether the goal is to build new infrastructure supporting new industries, potentially zero carbon industries, as well as new uses for electricity for artificial intelligence, data centers, and electrification. So it's a critical moment, and I'm so grateful that we have an amazing panel to talk about it. So I may introduce you in the order that I think I'll ask my first question. So we have Brian Potter here, who is a senior infrastructure fellow at the Institute for Progress. I very much encourage you, go read his blog. There are very few writers who write more interesting stuff about the current challenges with the energy system, as well as just how to think about energy. Energy is one of those things that brings together a lot of different disciplines, whether some science, some government, a lot of economic policy, and Brian is a very clear writer about things that, frankly, there aren't many clear writers about. So go read his writing. Then I'll likely ask a question of Alex Stapp, who's the co-CEO at the Institute for Progress. I encourage you to read everything on the Institute for Progress's website. I really don't think there's any think tank out there that's doing more, that has more practical suggestions, putting out legislative text that Congress could use to help fix these permitting problems, with both sort of bite-sized explanations that you can take to your Hill meeting, as well as longer explanations. They're really covering everything that you need for it does what it says on the tin. Institute for Progress. They're doing a great job over there. And then we have Thomas Hochman, who is the infrastructure, the head of director of infrastructure at the Foundation for American Innovation. A real machine in terms of putting out permitting information. He's one of your best X or Twitter follows that you can have on the area of infrastructure. Recently, issued the state permitting playbook, which is really cool. Just constantly working on important permitting projects. So, given the time and the place, I think we are going to focus on the federal permitting challenge. So how do we get federal permits, allow things to get federal permission to build? Note, there's a very important challenge about building projects, within states and locally. We'll probably try to talk about that if we can, but given that it's January 21st and we're here in DC, I think we'll focus mostly on federal policy. Often conversations about permitting focus on the National Environmental Policy Act, because that is the environmental review law in the United States. And you need to have an environmental assessment or impact statement done under the National Environmental Policy Act to get your federal permission to build, or sometimes if you're a project that's funded by the federal government. And so we'll talk about that, but I think as we'll discuss, there really are a lot of different statutes that are potential roadblocks to actually getting your infrastructure project built, and so we'll talk about those as well. Sometimes the National Environmental Policy Act is talked about kind of as both one of the primary examples, and also it's the sort of the umbrella law that sometimes those other statutes get considered under. Okay, as we talk about these reform options, I think, and I'd love for our panelists to be sort of clear about 3 potential avenues that we're talking about for changing the permitting system. So one is things that the administration or the president can do by himself. And we were all up late last night reading those executive orders. I just tweeted a whole space that Thomas and I did on that. But you can. But so there's a lot potentially there. But then the second avenue is things that can pass with 50 senators plus the vice president through the reconciliation process. And I think we've seen a secular trend toward more administration policy done through the reconciliation process, and I expect that to continue. And then the third is the kind of changes that would require 60 votes in the Senate, things that would be done outside of the reconciliation process. Okay, so with that, let me start with Brian, and you've done some really interesting work on the history of the energy industry, et cetera. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the National Environmental Policy Act and how it has impacted infrastructure construction.
Sure. So the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, it came together at the sort of tail end of the 1960s when there was this huge groundswell in environmental enthusiasm, concern about the environment. We sort of, looking back from 60 years ago, it's less obvious, but basically several decades of post-war economic growth had really done a real number on the environment, basically. You were having like these huge, horrible oil spills. Sewage was just getting dumped in lakes and rivers and streams everywhere. The sort of environmental movement grew out of sort of the conservation effort, which was basically to sort of keep certain lands pristine. Sort of unchecked economic growth had sort of led to sort of not just sort of those pristine lands getting polluted, but lands just everywhere getting polluted. And so it was a sort of bipartisan effort to try to sort of realize that this was a problem and try to solve it. And so the National Environmental Policy Act, if you read it, it's like a very, very high-minded bill that's like, we need to establish harmony between man and nature and ensure we sort of have good stewardship for the environmental law, for the environment going forward to the future, for our children, all this stuff. And none of that stuff ended up mattering at all in the law. None of it was enforceable. It was all this sort of like vague, abstract ideals that couldn't be translated into sort of actual policy. But then kind of at the last minute, when they were drafting the law, a sort of advisor to sort of one of the main sponsors, this guy Linton Caldwell, he basically added this sort of relatively small provision that put basically an action forcing mechanism into NEPA that basically said you have to produce a detailed statement of what the impacts will be. And nobody really paid much attention to it at the time. It didn't get sort of discussed on the congressional floor. It didn't get debated at all. There were no newspaper articles about it, partly it's because apparently Congress kind of wanted to sort of get the bill done and go home and for Christmas, and they just sort of, it really flew under the radar.
That's how all our best legislation gets passed, is that right? Okay.
And so eventually environmentalists who were sort of looking for ways, again, at the time there was the concern that's like all this sort of destructive development is happening. They were looking for ways to basically slow it down. And they realized that this sort of law gave them a sort of avenue to do that just by like, it sort of went hand in hand with sort of that environmental strategy of just suing projects to try to stop them, either to sort of stop them just completely or just delay them, make it so costly to kind of do them that it became sort of infeasible to do it. And a really big early shaping of how this took place was a case called Calvert Cliffs, which basically an atomic energy plant that was being developed, and the sort of AEC at the time, they had sort of just kind of done a very perfunctory environmental analysis. Oh, here's the effects. And then it got sued by environmental groups, and then the court basically said, no, you can't just you can't just this is not a box checking exercise. This has to be sort of baked into your process of how you sort of think about projects. And that's what really shaped how sort of the NEPA and its enforcement and how it's used by our environmental groups took place. Both that it has to be really baked into the process, and also that sort of judges would basically look quite closely and gave them an avenue to sort of sue projects. Anything that they didn't think, I'm not quite sure you looked hard enough here, it gave them an avenue to sort of try to stop those that they didn't like. And I guess sort of the broader sort of point of that is that this sort of took shape in an era where the main thing that environmental activists were trying to do was basically stop projects getting built. Anything getting built at all, they sort of viewed as destructive. It was very tied up with sort of the anti-growth movement and stuff like that. We're now in a very different regime where environmental activists basically means needing to build just an enormous amount of infrastructure. And I think the sort of cultural infrastructure in these sort of environmental groups and sort of the way that they operate and sort of how they're trained to think hasn't really quite caught up with that yet.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think it is interesting. If you go back and read NEPA, it's a little bit, the actual statutory text, it is a little bit surprising what a different moment it was. Because basically NEPA describes two things as the big problems. One is urbanization, and the second is population growth. And it's just, you would never hear somebody, or well, not never, but it's rare to hear that perspective today, and certainly would not have a lot of, it would not get a lot of support in the US Congress. So in some ways, NEPA does reflect a time period when basically people said, oh, we don't want more growth, right? And I think there's largely, a consensus now that population growth is good, that urban areas are good, like that we like and value cities, and that was a different there was a different time, and I think it reflects that. It's also really important to emphasize something Brian said. Look, this was supposed to be a procedural law, right? And it still is, in theory, a procedural law. It doesn't require the government to make any particular decisions. It just requires consideration of environmental impacts. But because, again, the Calvert-Cliffs decision, that's a decision of the DC Circuit. So that's not a decision of the Supreme Court. That's a decision of a 3-judge panel of the DC Circuit Court. But because the circuit courts in the United States, just a rung below the Supreme Court, have extremely aggressively applied the National Environmental Policy Act, although it's still just a procedural statute, those procedures have made it more and more difficult to approve projects. So to talk a little bit more about that, I was wondering, Alec, if you could talk just a little bit about how these environmental reviews can delay projects, what kinds of reforms have been proposed by Congress, and sort of what you think would be necessary reforms, or how you would evaluate some of the reform proposals out there.
Yeah, so as you and Brian both mentioned, environmental groups will tell journalists and the public on the record that their strategy when they sue under NEPA is delay, delay, delay. They want to eventually kill a project, either by getting its financing pulled or the developer goes bankrupt. They're trying to actually stop projects from getting built, at least in the previous paradigm. Now we're moving to a new world where increasingly people are realizing we need to build a lot of clean energy. And so there's a term we've started using at IFP called the litigation doom loop to describe these series of never-ending lawsuits that intend to trap and ultimately kill a project in the courts. And the case I think about most often is the Cardinal Hickory transmission line. This is a project that was just recently finished after 13 years of development. It was a transmission line, a 100-mile transmission line connecting Iowa and Wisconsin. It was going to bring 160 renewable energy projects on the grid, 24.5 gigawatts of power. And it was a very long process. They ended up doing 4 years of environmental review with a joint approval from 4 federal agencies. And once they completed that review process in 2021, outside conservationist groups immediately sued the project and got an injunction against construction. And the problem they claimed was that the project went through part of it went through a wildlife refuge, and then they think that the agencies didn't do enough review in terms of considering alternative measures for the transmission line. And so they remanded the decision back to the agencies for more review. There's one delay. Agency conducts more review, puts out a new environmental review supplemental, and the outside groups sue again, saying, you did not do enough review still. Another judicial injunction was issued. And I think the thing to keep in mind in your back of your head here is these groups are saying we have a value that is we care about conserving wildlife lands. The plan for this project actually added more land to the refuge area than it took for the transmission line to cut through. So on net, it was actually increasing the amount of wildlife refuge. But for some outside groups, that is not the goal. The goal is not technically about the raw quantity of wildlife area. It's about stopping projects that they think should just not go through areas that they want to protect at all, even if it's a transmission line to support clean energy projects. Now, ultimately, that project did get built in the end after surviving 2 judicial injunctions. But the key here is that litigation is about risk and uncertainty. And every other developer in the country who wants to build an infrastructure project observed this situation, and they are accounting for this going forward. They're not going to propose projects at all that might run into similar problems, or at the very least, the financing they need to raise for these projects will be much more expensive, and we're already in a high interest rate environment because backers know there's a chance you're going to get trapped in a potentially never-ending court battle with opposition. And so I think when we think about congressional reforms that might fix the problems we see in permitting, I think judicial review really is at the core of what needs to happen. Because if you don't address the incentives that the federal agencies face in terms of why are they creating multi-thousand-page reviews, why did they take 4.5 years on average currently, it's because they're trying to create litigation-proof documents that can help them win in court. And to be clear, the federal government does usually win. I think roughly on average, they win 75% of their cases. But it's not about whether they win or lose in terms of the opposition. The opponents are trying to delay, and ultimately kill the project.
Yeah, I think it might be worth highlighting a potential tension in Brian and Alex's comments, which is that when NEPA was passed and as it sort of turned into the incredibly stringent procedure that it is, environmental groups were focused on stopping new infrastructure. Now, environmental groups are much more split because there's a lot that say, hey, we've had 400 billion to 1.2 trillion, depending on how you count it, of subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are not going to actually help decarbonize our system in any way unless we can build new infrastructure. And most of the analyses that have been done of that have suggested that basically we won't get 80% of the benefit unless we build 10 times as many power lines as we've been building in recent years. Building 10 times as many power lines in the coming years is simply impossible unless we have a much faster permitting system. And for that reason, you see some, what you might call green groups, more like green energy groups, that are more supportive of changing permitting. At the same time, there's another group of green groups who are more about conservation, and they remain opposed to building new infrastructure projects because renewable energy or any of these projects do have effects on the environment, and so you see that these projects still get sued. And in fact, the cleaner energy sources tend to be more dependent on the long distance infrastructure like power lines, et cetera. And so they actually run into more roadblocks than some of your traditional fossil fuel projects. And so I think for that reason, what you might call green groups, which include sort of green energy groups and sort of more traditional environmentalist groups, have ended up kind of split on the need for reform. Okay, so Thomas, let me ask you, you spent a lot of time thinking about not only the National Environmental Policy Act, but some of the other federal laws that present challenges to new infrastructure, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. I wonder if you might lay out some of the problems there and then what some of the potential avenues there might be for reform.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that transmission is actually a really good example of how these different environmental statutes come together. So first of all, with something like the Endangered Species Act, it's often folded into the NEPA process, and so it's incredibly hard to see the role that it plays in blocking development. The reason that I think that NEPA and ESA reform, especially when it comes to litigation reform, sort of have to go together, is that if you just reform NEPA, ESA will still be there, right? But because NEPA and ESA share similar triggers, So NEPA is set off by a major federal action, which has really come to mean any federal action. ESA is set off by a federal agency action that has the potential to affect a threatened or endangered species. ESA is often integrated into that NEPA process. But I think that if NEPA were to disappear tomorrow, that burden of litigation, that burden of review, would simply shift to the Endangered Species Act. The other thing that makes the Endangered Species Act particularly challenging is that, much like NEPA, it has procedural requirements, which tend to be the most litigious aspects of the law. So particularly ESA Section 7 consultation, which requires agencies to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the NMFS. This is the most commonly litigated part of the Endangered Species Act. And we saw that with transmission all the time. We saw that with the Keystone XL pipeline. When states have tried to take primacy over the Clean Water Act, Section 404. Florida had its primacy revoked on Endangered Species Act grounds. So it really keeps showing up over and over again. The other one is the Clean Water Act, and particularly Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which is the state water quality certification. So what this says is, if there's a project that in your state that requires a federal water permit, the state has to issue a certification to allow that project to go forward. What that has meant in practice is that states have used that ability and that authority to block projects that they don't like, often not for environmental reasons, but for political reasons. So blue states often use Section 401 to block pipelines from moving forward. Red states have often used 401 to block transmission lines from moving forward. So particularly when it comes to linear infrastructure, which we know is exceptionally important, it's not just NEPA, although that certainly plays an enormous role, but also these other statutes that are often integrated or sort of done simultaneously with that NEPA review process.
If I could just jump in there real quick, I think I want to just emphasize something that could be an implication or what some people hear what Thomas just said, because I agree with basically everything he said of if we were to repeal NEPA or make dramatic reforms to NEPA, project opponents. Our system, you can think of our judicial system as adversarial legalism, to borrow a term from Professor Robert Kagan. They're looking to stop a project, and so if you take away their best tool, NEPA is the most litigated federal environmental statute, they'll look for other tools. And so there'll still be litigation, there'll still be project opponents. But I think some people hear that and think, okay, then there's no point in reforming NEPA. I take the opposite approach in terms of what should Congress do, what should policymakers do. This is a thicket of permitting processes that are a challenge and can be exploited by bad faith actors. But we have to start hacking away eventually, because it's very hard for, in one fell swoop to get all the reforms we need.
I think something related to that is something that comes up is like any major change to any of these sort of permitting rules in the short term creates more uncertainty, which is sort of that you're kind of trying to get rid of. This was, I think, something that came up with the Trump administration's NEPA reforms in his first term, which there was, actually I'm not 100% sure how this turned out, but there was a lot of speculation that while these were intended to sort of streamline the permitting process in the short term, they would make it unclear what you are allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do, what is going to get you sued, what will not get sued, how the sort of legal landscape is going to evolve. And so, in the short term, it creates more uncertainty. But I sort of agree with Alec on the broader point, but that the only way out is through. You have to still have to sort of be able to bite that bullet and sort of work through that to sort of make any progress.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you're getting water in your house, there's a leak in your house, and somebody says, well, it's not actually just the roof, it's also the side of the house. You don't say, well, then don't fix the roof, right? I mean, so basically, NEPA reform is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for building infrastructure at the rate that we need to. Okay, so let me actually sort of building on that in terms of the reform and some uncertainty that we're likely to see. Thomas, would you just tell us a little bit about the CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality Regulations saga, which is ongoing as of last night?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all still processing, right? I know that James and I got on a Twitter space for an hour at 10:30 last night trying to figure out what it all meant. I think that a lot of us saw the writing on the wall over the last couple months, because there was this Marin Audubon decision where the DC Circuit pretty much out of nowhere decided that they actually weren't even going to rule on the specifics of this NEPA case, because CEQ, which is the agency that it's been responsible for issuing what were thought of as binding regulations for the last almost 50 years, never had statutory authority in the first place to issue these regulations. They actually started issuing these regulations as binding regulations because of this President Carter executive order in 1977. And the DC Circuit said, well, those are not actually statutorily binding. And so it threw decades of regulations and case law that interacted with those regulations into doubt. And then last night, on the first day of his presidency, President Trump just rescinded that executive order from 1977. So Marine Audubon itself is maybe not moot, but certainly far less relevant than it was, because that executive order is now, from 1977, is now gone. What does that mean? Well, it means that agencies are now going to be responsible for interpreting NEPA and creating their own implementing procedures and their own regulations. I think we talked a lot about uncertainty that kind of filters out after a big change to a law like NEPA. I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty over the next couple of years. I think the long run impacts will be positive, though. There are questions around things like what constitutes a major federal action, right? And, what should kick off NEPA in the first place? What's a significant impact, right? Where's that line between what should kick off an environmental assessment and an environmental impact statement? Do we need to be doing cumulative effects analysis and indirect effects analysis, or should we just be looking at the direct impacts of a project? I think these are all really real opportunities for agencies to pare back those overreaches that CEQ treated as binding for the last 45 plus years. So that's where we are right now.
One brief comment on that. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this, because there's already a large amount of interagency variation in how stringent and thorough they were. You have some agencies that do these incredibly involved analyses, and then some the Corps of Engineers, which is really just wants to bulldoze through them and get them done as quick and sort of not perfunctory, but sort of short and sweet as possible. And it just, I assume that has a lot to do with different incentives that they face and who is sort of basically, all this is, defensive against litigation and sort of who is wanting to sue them and why. But so I expect we can just sort of see that to sort of become even more varied, perhaps, with sort of the changing of these executive orders?
Yeah, I think that CEQ regulations set the baseline, right? And a number of agencies were going beyond that, often for litigation proofing reasons. So one thing that James and I were talking about, and something that we hope to see, is CEQ now has an incredibly important job on its hands when it comes to issuing guidance for every single agency to create each agency's own implementing procedures. And one thing that's going to be really important is not to say, you must no longer consider environmental justice impacts or cumulative effects analysis or climate change impacts, but rather these are now optional. Because if you remove the ability to consider something completely and you ban it, it opens you up to all sorts of litigation opportunities. But if you sort of leave these different options on the table, it's much harder for groups to sue.
Yeah, and let me underline that point, because it's a potential pitfall for the new administration, and it maybe plays into this question of, did the first Trump term, create some kind of uncertainty? So, if you come to government with a business background and you say, these reviews are taking too long, let's consider fewer things, right? That would be that would work in a company where a CEO has complete control over the outcome. They can just reach a faster decision. That's not how it works in government, because there's other veto gates other than the president. And particularly there's the courts. So the courts get a decision. Now courts, when they review an environmental analysis, they are typically not going to disagree with the agency about something within its technical expertise that the agency has explained well, right? The reason that they're going to overturn the agency is because they're going to say, well, you didn't consider this at all, or something that you said is just illogical. But probably the easiest way for them to overturn something is to say, you didn't consider this at all. So if the president or CEQ, and so CEQ, it seems, is not going to have binding regulations anymore, but can issue guidance to the agencies on how they do their environmental reviews. If CEQ says, don't consider greenhouse gas emissions from this project, or don't consider downstream greenhouse gas emissions from this project, if the courts look at that, that in some ways gives them an easy excuse to strike down the project, because they can say, well, your regulations say you didn't consider this at all. And so that's why there might need to be, some ways that the agencies can basically say in the alternative, look, I don't think this is relevant. But if you ask me to consider, even if I did include all the carbon emissions downstream from this project, even if I did use the previous administration's social cost of carbon, I would still find that this project is in the national interest or should be approved. And so I think, you may, if they're really trying to get some projects through to actually build those infrastructure projects, approaches like that might potentially make more sense. Alec, I wonder if you've talked a little bit about this, and we've had some of this on the panel, but just if you could say some more about what projects in particular run into challenges with federal permitting.
Yeah, so I think, Thomas hinted at this a little bit, but I think it's linear infrastructure projects face the biggest challenges. So pipelines and transmission lines in particular, because they span multiple jurisdictions, because we have a federal system of government. And so if you are a pipeline developer or a transmission developer and you're building a potentially multi-100-mile project, you're going to span multiple local, state jurisdictions. You're going to have federal implications as well once you cross state lines. And you'll have to deal with land acquisition if you cross private land and maybe need to use eminent domain as well. And so you're in this situation where you're faced with potentially dozens of actors who have the ability to veto your project, not to mention all the outside environmental groups that will come in after the approval for the project is done. And so that's why you see things like to build an interstate transmission line in the United States, it currently takes more than 10 years on average. And we've been building fewer transmission lines year over year for the last 15 years. Because it's exceedingly difficult to get everyone on the same page. As Thomas mentioned, the blue states don't want pipelines on average passing through them. The red states aren't particularly excited about transmission lines. And so this is where you really see the American vetocracy in action. And the more authorities you need to get to consent to your project, the harder it is to build. And I think from there it's a spectrum. So linear infrastructure I think of as the hardest. Easier projects are the ones that have a smaller footprint, maybe a small natural gas facility built in a red state on private land. You can do that pretty quickly. And then in the middle, maybe you have something like larger generation facilities like solar and wind that actually do have a large land mass and usually will need to have an environmental impact statement just because of the amount of land they're impacting, even if they don't cross state lines or have some other kind of federal nexus.
Yeah, I think this is something that's not always understood, is how permitting is a giant challenge to wind and solar, not because necessarily the projects themselves need a federal permit, but if you ask folks, what's stopping you from building more wind and solar? Well, it's, can we find land where it's done? A lot of the places on private land have maybe been built out. If you look at more, development, a lot of it would be on federal lands, et cetera, where permitting would apply, but much more than that even. A big challenge is transmission. We are waiting in an interconnect queue because there's not sufficient transmission. We don't even have transmission to the spots where we need it. And so that's why most of the analyses suggest that basically you lose 80% of the renewable power that you were expecting to build under the Inflation Reduction Act unless you have a tenfold increase in transmission, which means a lot more permits federal permits for these transmission projects. I think, Brian,
one just addition to what Alex said. Also, what has an easier time is the industries that have been around for a lot longer and had much more time to sort of work the process. There's a term that our colleague Aidan McKinsey used in a piece he did about this, and I cannot remember. I'm going to screw it up a little bit, but it's basically something like the legal learning curve, where you have to just how building physical things, you sort of fall down the learning curve as you build more of it, you get better at it. With sort of these legal processes, you get better at it the more you do it, and the agencies learn how to work with you, and you learn how to work with the agencies, and how to sort of get sort of exceptions that you need to sort of make it easier, or to sort of know what they are expecting to see and sort of give it to them. And the newer industries, stuff like solar and wind, but especially even really, really newer stuff like geothermal, has just not had that time to sort of fall down this legal learning curve. And so it takes them a lot longer to sort of go through the process than these sort of much longer in-place industries that have had sort of time to figure out how to work the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Infrastructure approval is a muscle that you lose unless you're using it, and certain industries have been using it for longer, undoubtedly. I think, and Zach, who's speaking in the next panel, has some really interesting thoughts on that as well. So I was going to ask. You actually have this idea of sort of NEPA's anti-law too that maybe I'll ask, and then I'll be looking for Q&A from the audience. So get your questions ready.
This is a cute little term I came up with. But at a high level, when you create a law, you basically are trying to do kind of one of two things. Is that A, you're trying to sort of prevent something that you would like less of, or theoretically encourage something that you would like more of. And the other one is just try to sort of solve coordination problems. So example of that second thing is like traffic laws, where we don't necessarily want people to drive on the right side of the road or stop at red lights because those are inherently good. It's just useful if everybody agrees that those are the rules we're going to follow when we're driving on the road. And so NEPA arguably does kind of neither of these things. It does not create more of something that we would like or less of something that we don't like, because it doesn't, as we've said, it doesn't specifically require you to sort of mitigate environmental impacts. It only requires you to sort of document them. And I think maybe other folks can speak well to it, but I believe that the sort of the research that's been done is very unclear as to whether it's like actually what sort of impacts it has on sort of reducing environmental impacts and things like that. And as we've seen with coordination problems, it doesn't really solve those either. It creates this whole raft of new coordination problems because it creates all this uncertainty. The sort of legal standards are kind of always changing because it basically depends on what sort of judges will find for. There's this term NEPA common law because it's sort of how it's enforced is determined by like what other court cases come along. And so again, if you think of it in terms of like what a law should do, NEPA is not doing any of it.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean you both talked about two different ways that the National Environmental Policy Act actually has a disproportionate effect on harming lower carbon industries. So one is because for newer industries they're going to face a bigger challenge jumping over these legal hurdles for the first time before other projects have shown the way. But the other one is that those newer industries like wind and solar are uniquely dependent on linear infrastructure. If you can get oil out of the ground, you can find a way to get it to people because it can be sent by tanker, by truck, by rail, by pipeline. But you can't build a wind or solar farm unless you have that transmission hooked up to it directly. And that's true also of newer industries like hydrogen, geothermal, et cetera. You're going to need transmission. You're going to need that linear infrastructure. And so those lower carbon industries are disproportionately impacted by permitting requirements. So with that, why don't we take some questions from the audience for our panelists? Yes, please.
As I listened to you talk, I was thinking about the various speeches I heard yesterday. So I want to say two questions, but they're really related. Question number one is, what would you recommend that the, quote, Department of Governmental Efficiency do to make things easier? And number two, which is related, given that the boss of that department said that he was opposed to wind and solar, what would you advise they do to make it harder to do wind and solar?
Okay, and on to the first half of that question. To make it easier, I think in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, this was the debt ceiling deal from 2023, they had some modest permitting reforms included in that bill as part of the broader package. And one of the reforms that was included there was that federal agencies could adopt categorical exclusions from other agencies that had already been developed. And I think this is a new authority that the agencies have, a new ability, and so they're only beginning to start to use this. And we saw this adopted from when the Bureau of Land Management adopted a categorical exclusion for geothermal. They adopted it from other agencies. And I think what you can see DOGE come in with some very smart technical people that they're already hiring is to do this 30,000 foot view of what are all the categorical exclusions on the books? How can we copy and paste them to other contexts in which they'd be relevant? And additionally, you could also do things around programmatic environmental impact statements. And so we can clear large parts of federal land or other areas of the country that could be ready to go for developers on day one. And I think a lot of this is about data management, writing clear guidance, and then copy pasting across agencies and making things more consistent. And I think the technical folks at Doge could be pretty good at that.
One question. Are we sure that we can still do programmatic environmental impact statements after this EO was rescinded? Because my sense is that that was something that was relying on CEQ regulations and might now be called into question. Does anybody, do you know? Yeah.
But if it's relying on it, doesn't mean it needs to require it. But it's like you can still do it at the agency. If their internal process is like, let's adopt this.
Sure. I think there's uncertainty around. Certainly, there's some categorical exclusions which have been which are now have statutory basis. But there are also now questions about whether or not certain types of categorical exclusions that maybe we could have issued before can now be issued. And I gather PEIS has fallen into that same bucket. But I don't know.
It's an interesting question because there's the whole body of CEQ regulations that have been developed, mostly from starting with 1978, and really that was where the heart of those regulations came from. And so now those have been invalidated by the DC Circuit, and then in theory basically rescinded by this new executive order. But you have other parts of those CEQ regulations that are now a part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and passed by Congress. And so it's like we've added some pieces to the shell, but then removed the whole shell. So it's a little bit unclear about what parts of what Congress has allowed are going to be, or has authorized, are going to now be part of the environmental review process. And I think there were some things that were messy about that fiscal, that was like permitting reform. It had a lot of not very helpful ideas. For instance, it was going to limit the number of pages in an environmental review. Again, sounds like, it may sound like a good idea, except for from the 1978 regs, the very first regs that we had, those also said we should have a page limit. And that has never meant anything because the courts have required more and more review. And so if you're the agency and you have to pass court review, you don't pay much attention to these page limits that you don't actually have to worry about. So anyway, I think Congress to clean this up, is going to have to pass something. But there's this big challenge of what can you pass either with 60 votes in the Senate or through the reconciliation process. Okay, other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks, Jonathan Gifford from George Mason. Very interesting panel. What is the impact of the committee jurisdiction over these laws? Are they all under the same committees, or does that complicate matters further?
Yeah, that really counts. A fantastic question. This is part of why I think major comprehensive permitting reform has not yet gotten across the finish line in recent years, is because there's split committees of jurisdiction. And so in the Senate, you have Senate Energy and Natural Resources, and you have EPW, Environment and Public Works, and they share jurisdiction over this issue. And what we saw last Congress was the big bipartisan deal, which I think would have been a step in the right direction, would not have solved all of our problems, but would have been good if it passed, was the Manchin-Barrasso deal, chair and ranking member of Senate E&R. And they did, I think, what they could do under their jurisdiction, and you did not see a similar process playing out on Senate EPW. And so then you got to the last minute where you're post-election in a transition period trying to negotiate with the Manchin-Barrasso text as your base text and then add in things on top that go further on judicial review, which is a big part of what EPW has under its jurisdiction. And that didn't come together at the last minute. But it just makes it so much harder in terms of coordination problems. We were talking about earlier, coordination problems within the Senate, across the Senate and the House. You have a lot of powerful people who want to get their preferred policy into the final package, and potentially a lot of veto players that make it very difficult as well.
Yeah, and I would also just say, if you're wondering if a permitting reform would have make a big substantive change in our ability to build infrastructure, you want to look at the judicial review provisions, since that's the primary veto gate. And that's another big challenge that's probably the biggest challenge of coordination in the Senate, is getting them to actually look at those judicial review. And note, when we really, really want to build something, we typically waive the ability of the courts to stop it with any of these laws. And so we saw that with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, with the border wall. So the question is, if when you're looking at these, just always look at the judicial review provisions. That's going to tell you how much of an impact it's really going to have on speeding up permitting. Okay, I think there was another question in the back.
So what is the best way to relieve this litigation pressure? Seems like that's a central issue in many permitting reforms, like this CEQ removal. Seems like it could even make this worse. Like you were saying, the agencies can't even now point to the CEQ regulations and say, at least I'm following these with their programmatic EIS. They kind of have to defend everything on its own merits. So how do we get rid of or ameliorate this litigation pressure? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, I don't totally agree. I think that there will be a period of uncertainty, right, where agencies have to figure out what the appropriate implementing procedures are, so that they don't get sued over and over again. At the same time, litigants can no longer use CEQ regulations as grounds, right? So courts no longer have to be attentive to CEQ regulations when somebody sues. So in a sense, it sort of narrows that procedural hook that you can use to sue on, right? And the second piece is I think that there's going to be a lot more, there will be more questions around kind of what is reasonable for agencies to do given the language of the statute. So again, I think that with a lot of these things, for the first 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, you'll see a lot of litigation, and then things will slowly peter out, and agencies will end up having a less burdensome standard to abide by. But I think, to your point, Congress needs to do something. We need more certainty. Maybe we get it in reconciliation. It seems even more likely that we get it in the surface transportation reauthorization in 2026. You need 60 votes there, but it's a must-pass bill. So there are a lot of opportunities over the next 2 years, but I think that this executive order becomes so much more powerful if you also get Congress to act, right? Because you are relieving some of those direct requirements. And then if you can combine that with relieving some of the judicial review burden, that's enormously powerful, I think.
And I think there are different ways you can reform judicial review to make improvements. Our preferred solution at IFP that we actually developed in partnership with James is a time limit on judicial injunctions. Because when you just think about this adversarial process, what is the goal that the opposition to a project, what is their goal? It's to stop the project. And what is their preferred tool? It's to get an injunction issued against the project, a court-issued injunction. And so the best amount of certainty you could provide, beyond just abolishing the laws that you think are a problem, is to provide a time limit on judicial injunctions. And you can structure this in different ways. Our preferred solution would start at notice of intent. This actually complements the shot clocks that we mentioned earlier, where shot clocks on their own, in terms of the review has to be done in 2 years or less, do almost nothing, and in some ways make things worse. But if you have a shot clock for 2 years on the books, and you had a separate time limit, say 3 years, for judicial injunctions from notice of intent, now you have a process that it could look like: get the review done in 2 years. There's 1 year for the courts to make sure nothing egregious was missed, but beyond that, an injunction cannot be issued against the project. And then, because we're in an iterated game where all the players, the project developers, the agencies, and the opposition, the environmental groups primarily, observe this, they will know that they cannot use this tool to indefinitely delay a project and ultimately kill it. And so then I think you'll see less bad faith litigation brought in general, because they'll know that they'll ultimately fail and it's not worth the expense. That's our preferred solution, but there are many different ways to improve judicial review.
Could you talk about nuclear power?
Brian, you're the nuclear guy.
Yeah, sure. So, one thing is that nuclear is a really interesting example of like the importance of like certainty and predictability. With a lot of this, NEPA stuff, a lot of the impacts end up being sort of dark matter, because you don't see them, because it just takes the form of projects that just never get off the ground in the first place, because somebody looks in and says, I have no idea how long it's going to take me. I don't know what it's going to cost. I don't have any idea how many times I'm going to get sued. I'm just not going to do it at all. But with nuclear, you see this evolving, uncertainty landscape in real time while they're trying to build nuclear plants. And you can basically see the outcome of that, which is that nuclear plants got steadily more and more and more expensive to build. They, most, like I talked about earlier, most things, when you build more of it, the costs per unit costs come down over time as you fall down the learning curve. Nuclear has, in the US at least, has a reverse learning curve, a negative learning curve. It gets more and more expensive as you build more of it. And a very large part of that was due to sort of regulatory uncertainty, was because as they were building these plants, the sort of regulations kept changing, and the sort of NRC was issuing new rules all the time. And so they were having to sort of like rip stuff out that they already built and put it back in, or like sort of, a rule that had been interpreted one way started to be interpreted sort of another way after the fact. And you still see this today with a lot of these plants that have gone way over budget, both in the US and in Europe. So I think nuclear is sort of a perfect example of like why certainty and sort of predictability should be sort of your overarching goal, rather than just necessarily like, we just don't want any restrictions at all. It's just tell us what the restrictions are and stick to them, and then we can sort of have a regime that we can operate in.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, judicial review under the National Environmental Policy Act is a project manager's nightmare, because it is not a regulation that you can plan for at the start. What it is it's a requirement that comes in sort of out of the blue based on the preferences of a couple of judges that, 10 years into your project, all of a sudden changes how it's built. So my understanding of places where they've been able to build nuclear cheaply, like in France, if you have a brilliant idea, if they're in the middle of constructing this reactor and you have a brilliant idea for how it can be safer and more efficient, et cetera, you come to them, they say, that's awesome. That's so cool. When we build another nuclear reactor in 10 years, we are going to take that into consideration. But there is no way in hell that we are going to do it on this project. And that's how you keep costs down. But the National Environmental Policy Act and judicial review doesn't allow you to do that, because there's going to be an injunction and you have to completely change the plans to deal with it. And so it really is a giant problem for long timeline, multi-billion-dollar projects. And those are the kind of projects that we would need to really up our supply of low carbon energy.
I will just add, though, even in France, which has often been held up as the most successful case, at least in the West, of a nuclear scale-up, we still saw negative learning. So we still saw saw reactors get more expensive over time. And that was despite the fact that the French push for nuclear was exceptionally centralized. So they pushed down the reactor designs through one nationalized electric utility. There was enormous standardization across all reactors. And we tend to think of standardization as one of the ways that you clamp down on that negative learning. And so I do think that there is a unique challenge with nuclear that we do have to reckon with, which is that the upfront capital costs are enormous and they're exceptionally complex. People refer to them as cathedrals, right? They're just incredibly complicated. And so I think that there are a lot of positive externalities that nuclear have that maybe don't fit neatly within sort of our levelized cost of energy framework. And clearly, the way that we regulate nuclear is a huge challenge that we should address. But it's also not clear that regulations alone are sort of this singular barrier that are holding back the U.S. Nuclear industry.
I'll make one additional brief comment on nuclear related to that. Is that in general, sort of power plants, they have like economies of scale in terms of size, where you want to build it as big as possible, essentially due to sort of area volume rules. The bigger you build it, the sort of less material it takes and the cheaper it is. Nuclear has some sort of potentially interesting negative scaling effects where it perhaps will get cheaper if you can build it smaller, just because a smaller nuclear plant is perhaps fundamentally safer, and you don't need such sort of these horrible burden of like safety systems that is what is driving the cost nuclear plants in a lot of ways. There's obviously a lot of enthusiasm about small modular reactors today. That's sort of where a lot of the the energy in the sort of nuclear space is being directed to. I haven't done a ton of research into it. It's sort of on my to-do list to sort of dive into this area more deeply. But there was recently a lawsuit filed against the Nuclear Regulatory Commission by Last Energy in a few states, I think Utah, basically saying that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is sort of has overstepped its bounds and is regulating these sort of small reactors where it doesn't actually have jurisdiction. And because they're sort of fundamentally safer, maybe we don't actually need to go through these NRC processes. And again, we can sort of basically reduce the cost of the safety systems, but also the sort of the regulatory cost on those as well. So it'll be interesting to see how sort of that evolves.
And just to add really quickly on that, if there's executive actions that the Trump administration could do on their own, DOJ could, as they've just been sued, it's Texas, Utah, and Last Energy, they could just surrender. They could say, we agree, and we surrender in this case. And then, like that, NRC wouldn't have regulatory authority over small reactors.
Do we have time for one more question? All right, please.
Yeah, I was just curious. Thank you. I was curious, I don't remember who mentioned it, but in the scenario in which NEPA is no longer a litigation issue, you do anticipate that other environmental regulations will create litigation problems? And have you thought about which regulations those are?
I think this is a great time to plug our substantive versus procedural framework here. So the reason that I brought up NEPA and ESA together is because they have these procedural provisions, or NEPA itself is just a procedural law, which is to say that rather than mandating an outcome, it mandates a process. This is different from a law like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, where the Clean Air Act says you may not emit above this level or concentration of pollution, or you may not discharge this amount into the water. That's a substantive law. It's pretty clear what your standards are, and thus you're less open to litigation as long as you can show that you meet those substantive clear standards. With a law like NEPA or a law like the Endangered Species Act, because you get often sued on the adequacy of your consultation or your failure to complete the correct amount of review or the completeness of the administrative record, it's a lot less ambiguous, the standards are a lot less clear, and so it's much more easy. It's much easier to be sued. To be clear, I totally agree that we need to start with NEPA. That's where we are. And I do think that it's not a question of we need to reform all environmental laws or we just need to reform NEPA. I really do think that the Endangered Species Act is the next one after this. I think Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act is it's a different set of issues that are there, and it sort of has less to do with judicial review.
Yeah, we were joking on Twitter. There's all this excitement. Look at all this mineral wealth in Greenland. And do you really want to impose NEPA on Greenland, right? I mean, if there are all the minerals there, maybe better not. And Thomas joked that he was starting to look for what endangered species are in. I can't remember what the town was. I couldn't spell it either. So so in any event, I think with that we're done with the panel. But I just wanted to thank our panelists so much for this fascinating and important discussion.
Can we turn on this microphone? Even better? Thank you, everybody. I know that there's caffeine and sugar in the hallway, but you can bring that into this room. Are we getting everybody back in? Okay, wonderful. That first panel was terrific, and we're running just a few minutes behind schedule, which means that we're ahead of schedule using a current policy baseline. And I will now turn the mic over to Heidi for this next session. Thank you.
Great. I appreciated Michael's introduction when he said permitting is an issue that's economically important, but also technically complicated. So unlike James, I'm an economist. I don't specialize in administrative law. And so oftentimes when economists try to understand technically complicated issues, we think about analogies of policy areas that we can think about and learn from. And so if we think of permitting as a set of government approvals that you need to obtain before you make an investment, that, at least for me, very naturally draws up the Food and Drug Administration as a potential analogy to draw on. And so new drugs in the US require evidence from randomized clinical trials that those drugs are safe and effective. Those clinical trial requirements impose costs and reduce the number of new drugs that are produced and made available to patients. That FDA approval process is implicitly justified based on the benefits that we think that the information generated in those clinical trials provides about the safety and efficacy and appropriateness of those drugs for consumers. And so to put a sharper point on that statement, the 1962 amendments for the FDA were primarily motivated by wanting to prevent episodes like the thalidomide episode. So if you think about permitting, so permitting similarly increases the costs of and imposes delays in various types of investment. And as was emphasized in the first panel, also creates follow-on litigation risk. So it's not just a fixed cost of doing a specific activity, but it's kind of this tail risk of follow-on litigation that may arise that's attached to those processes. And the benefits that we think that we're obtaining from those permitting processes, again, not just at the federal level, but also at the state, local, and tribal level, is that we think that there's benefits from the information that's generated about the potential impacts on communities and the environment. And so policy debates about both health and environment tend to be very wide-ranging in their discussion about costs and benefits. And so, if you think about how society would trade off the value of safer and higher efficacy drugs for patients today relative to drugs that future patients may not have access to, those are things that are very loaded and end up being, multiplied by a bunch of things about the value of a statistical life. And similarly for environmental debates. So Joe Kyle, who's on our panel from the Congressional Budget Office, is going to make clear that CBO's mandate is not to do those types of broad cost-benefit analyses, but CBO instead has a narrower mandate, which is to provide Congress and the public with information about how policy changes, including in the permitting space, would affect the federal budget. As requested or required, CBO will also provide information on how policy changes would affect investment and economic growth and the feedback effects of those types of changes on the federal budget. And so our panelists are obviously welcome to talk about whatever they would like, but we kind of very intentionally tried to structure this around impacts on the economy, in part because, in my view, that's a perspective that's often underemphasized in these kinds of debates, and I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of focus more squarely on that issue. And then just to reiterate something that Michael disclosed at the beginning, in addition to being a faculty member at Dartmouth, I want to be sure to emphasize, so I have a part-time position at CBO, which includes supporting Joe on our CBO's permitting work. So let me introduce our other two panelists. When members of Congress and their staffs have questions about permitting, they're often asking because they're very interested in impacts on oil and gas production. And one example is the Common Sense Permitting Act from 2018. And so Eric Lewis has done some research specifically on federal lands and oil and gas leasing that he's going to talk about some evidence from those sectors. Other times, congressional interest focuses on transportation infrastructure and clean energy infrastructure, which are two areas that Zach Liskow, who's on our panel from Yale Law, has worked on. And that is kind of another area where I think there's the start of kind of evidence that's needed to inform how places like CBO would think about projecting the impacts of policy changes. But what I want to emphasize is it's easy for people to lose track of just how broad the effects of changes in permitting could be on the US economy. And so NEPA often gets too much focus in these areas. And so I'm going to use NEPA as an example, but I really don't mean to emphasize NEPA as being kind of the central thing in terms of importance. NEPA is just incredibly broad. And so some of these terms were thrown around in our first panel, but because the details are important, I just want to state it more precisely. So NEPA applies to major federal actions of several types: actions proposed on federal lands, actions requiring passage across federal lands, actions funded either entirely or in part by the federal government through any discretionary programs because they create what's called a federal nexus, and actions that affect the air or water quality regulated by federal law. So what that broad definition means is that even though we spend a lot of time talking in policy spaces about oil and gas or about transportation or about clean energy infrastructure, NEPA is much broader than that. And so the recent discussions around controlled burns that are done and how permitting interacts with that from the US Forest Service is, I think, a good example. But it's hard to make this sentence in a very precise way, but any private investment that is touched by $1 of federal subsidies or federal loans, in theory is triggering NEPA. So it's not just federal actions like federal investment. There's a lot of private investment in the economy that's touched by these statutes. So as an economist who's myself done research on how regulation affects private investment, I think one reason it's important to keep that breadth in mind is that a lot of the costs of regulations, statutes like these permitting statutes, come in the form of investments that could have happened but didn't. And so when places like the Congressional Budget Office need to project out policy counterfactuals, how would things change if we had differences in policy? They need to project what's the counterfactual public and private investment, what's the economic value of those investments that don't happen? And carefully constructed research designs are really the only way that we have to get at that. Because if we just look at the investments that do happen, that's gonna give us a very incomplete picture of how permitting is shaping the US economy. And so in the past, the federal government has sometimes chosen to exempt certain projects from NEPA or other permitting requirements that they felt like were important to do more quickly or to have more certainty in them moving forward. So two examples are semiconductor fabrication facilities that were exempted from NEPA if they were subsidized under the CHIPS and Science Act, and also the construction of the border wall, which was actually exempt from a much broader set of things, not just from NEPA. And circling back to the FDA example that I mentioned, so expedited review, faster review of projects by the FDA, that's something that is commonly used for certain kinds of drugs, so drugs that fill unmet medical needs, for example. And the question is, how and where do policymakers want to apply things like expedited review at the FDA or categorical exemptions from NEPA as part of balancing these trade-offs in different ways? And I think what's important is that research can really provide a solid framework for having a more fact-based discussion of what those trade-offs are. So against that background, I'm going to start by letting Joe Kyle, who's the Director of Microeconomic Analysis at the Congressional Budget Office, give a sense of how CBO thinks about things, and then I'll move on to our other two panelists.
All right, thank you, Heidi. That was generous. Thank you to Michael and James for organizing this and AEI for hosting it. I want to emphasize just one thing that Heidi said in the introduction about the role of CBO to give some context for the work that we do. So CBO's role is to assess the budgetary and economic effects of legislation that are bills that the Congress would consider. Our role is not to focus on benefit cost analysis or to opine on whether a particular policy or policy proposal would be a good idea or a bad idea. So we're really focused on the budgetary and economic effects. And to provide a very simple example in kind of the current context, imagine that the Congress were to consider a bill that would increase production of oil and gas on federal lands. CBO, in the course of its work, would estimate the effects of that potential bill or that potential policy on royalty collections and rental collections and bonus bids and those sorts of things that directly affect the federal budget, and those would inform CBO's cost estimate. In those cost estimates, CBO ordinarily presumes that the size of the economy, so GDP and other macroeconomic variables, remain unchanged. And CBO produces hundreds of these cost estimates every year along the wide range of things that the Congress considers. In some instances, that assumption about the size of the economy isn't a realistic assumption or isn't a desirable assumption, and either members of Congress or the budget committees will ask us, or House rules will require CBO to do what we call a dynamic assessment of a particular policy. And that's something that we do, as I mentioned, either under House rules or as requested, and we've done it in the past for things like infrastructure spending or changes to tax law. I want to focus on one example from about a decade ago, just because I think it provides some context in the energy space that I think is useful. So in the middle of the fracking boom, which probably started around 2005 or so, we needed to understand better the effects of fracking on the budget and the economy. And so we undertook a project to try to estimate those effects. And drawing some information from EIA's projections of energy production, where I think in roughly 2014, they were estimating that in addition to the increase in oil and gas production that had already occurred, that they were estimating a further 60% increase in natural gas production and 30% relative to a baseline in which fracking didn't continue. And a result of that was substantial declines in the prices of oil and especially of natural gas in the projections. And we were trying to understand the effects of that on the economy and the federal budget, and we did an analysis that showed, playing out over the course of a decade or so, that the effect of those changes, the technological advances in fracking, that the GDP would be about 1% larger than it otherwise would have been, and that similarly federal revenues would be about 1% larger. So this is the type of analysis that CBO sometimes does, and I think that's instructive for a couple of reasons. One is it gives you a sense that energy policy and permitting policy can matter, but the changes in fracking were actually quite large in terms of the additional energy production, and so we would look at basically three things that are important to understanding whether a particular policy would potentially have a large effect. And one is sort of the coverage or applicability of a policy would need to be broad for it to have an effect. So by analogy with fracking, there was a large increase in energy production, and that was one of the things that led to a large economic and budgetary effect. A second thing that we would look at in analyzing a particular proposal would be whether the permitting or legislative changes would be effective. So what do I mean by effective? And I'm going to be very abstract here and just imagine there's a world in which somebody wants something to happen and there are two constraints to that happening, and the particular proposal would address one of those two constraints, leaving the other in place. That's likely not to be terribly effective in having an effect. And then the third thing that we would think about, and that was part of the fracking work, was that the activity that would be allowed under the change in permitting or the change in energy is economically valuable. So again, in the case of fracking, the United States produced a lot more oil and gas, and that's valued at market prices. And in other instances, the activity that perhaps more broadly relating to permitting, the activity that would be allowed would need to be economically valuable. So this brings me where we are today. Obviously, the president announced a number of executive actions yesterday, and Congress may consider legislation that would change either energy production or permitting more broadly. And those could be, I think, in the areas that people are writing and talking about, which is increased production on federal lands, or easier access to building long linear projects, pipelines, and transmission lines, or other things like export terminals, or perhaps more broadly, things like facilitating the data centers and AI computation centers, as well as the energy to support that. So I can't speak to any particular future piece of legislation because the details matter a lot. And it's probably actually really worth emphasizing that any particular piece of legislation, we would look at the entire potential change in law. But I think there's three building blocks that we would consider in thinking about potential future legislation. And the first of those, I think, is fairly intuitive. That we would look at the scope of the proposal. So trying to understand the economic and budgetary effects, we would look at whether the proposal is broad or narrow, whether it applies to a specific geographic area or a specific type of activity, or whether it generally approves certain types of activities. And that's kind of one building block that would be part of our analysis. I think a second building block is the legal analysis that would need to be done. And this isn't my area of expertise, so I'm not going to say much on that other than we would look at how federal, state, local, and tribal laws interacted, and how a legislative proposal might affect those interactions, either across levels of government or across different existing legislation, NEPA, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species, those sorts of things that have already been mentioned. The third element, and this is, I think, particularly critical and particularly challenging, is what would the change in legislation do to private economic activity? So there's an important element in trying to think about how legislation would affect private investment. And I think that actually is a pretty key and pretty difficult thing for anyone to get their arms around. And I think in Michael's opening remarks, he said this was a particularly understudied area. So CBO has a couple of projects ongoing internally, trying to generate estimates of how generic changes in either energy production or permitting would affect private investment. But this is something where we would benefit from more research in this area. And CBO has written in the past on its website on the need for that sort of additional research. And similarly, there was an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives last year that CBO wrote on a variety of things, including the need for more research on changes in permitting. So that is a particularly challenging element of this for us. And so I'm really delighted that Eric and Zach are doing work in this area, and look forward to their comments today and their work in the future. So let me stop there, and happy to continue.
Great. So as I mentioned, Eric, you've done kind of a variety of work largely related to oil and gas leasing on federal land. Do you just want to summarize a little bit about some of the things that you've taken away from that?
Yeah. Yeah. So So I'm an economist. A lot of my research is on oil and gas and thinking about regulation. I think I really have two main points. First off, it's actually hard to look at the empirical impact of permitting on oil and gas development, and I'll talk about why. And second, I'll show you some evidence from Wyoming that permitting does seem to matter, at least to some extent, but the effects might be a little bit smaller than you might have expected. So here's a graph that kind of shows you the flow chart of what happens with oil and gas development. This is specific to BLM land, or excuse me, to Bureau of Land Management, which is federally owned land. But you could think about similar flow charts for offshore. Okay, and really when we're thinking about permitting here, permitting really comes into play simply for those federally owned resources, for that onshore oil and gas. It's the permitting process for these very local drilling projects doesn't really apply in the same way for state and private land. And you can see the application for the permit to drill is that bottom right corner. Once after the operator has already been leasing the land, then they say, hey, okay, it's really time to drill. Okay, as part of that, they need to submit an application for a permit to drill, and then the Bureau of Land Management does a bit of a review, including a bit of an environmental review that comes from NEPA, Endangered Species Act, as well as other things like protecting antiquities. Okay. If the BLM doesn't find the plans to be sufficient, then BLM may ask the operator to go back and modify its plans, or it might eventually just simply deny the application. So I mentioned that it's actually kind of hard to quantify the impact of permitting. Okay, and so in particular, you can see that this is just the application for the permit to drill is just one step in that process, and rules and simply just how the system works affect the eventual oil and gas development. So thinking about how is that parcel actually allocated to the market? Well, it's done by auction. Well, then some of the other details also matter. So for example, how long does a lease last? That's going to affect the oil and gas drilling outcomes, and it's going to be another part of federal regulation. There's also royalties that get paid to the US government as part of production. That's also going to affect whether drilling happens, how much production happens. Okay, so this makes it a little bit hard to say, let's actually dive into the permitting part for that application for the permit to drill. Second thing is you might say, well, why don't we just compare federal land with other land where we don't have these the federal permitting? Well, state and private land is similarly complicated. Okay, so if you look at that very bottom row, you can see that federal land, you need to get a federal drilling permit as well as a state drilling permit, whereas for state and private land, those are typically just regulated by the states with a lot, typically lower burden to show that you're actually doing a good job of whatever your responsibilities are. But you can see that there's lots of other differences as well. So one of the interesting things is the lease term. How long do you actually have to drill? Federal land is actually kind of generous in that it gives the firm, the operator, 10 years to drill. That's typically shorter on state and private land. And operators really like to have a long lease term. Gives them more time, it gives them more flexibility, but also having a longer lease term actually might lead to delayed drilling. Another thing that's different is royalty. So the royalty rate, the royalty is the fraction of your revenues that you pay to the lessor. So either to the private landowner or to the government for whom you're leasing the oil and gas lease. So private land, there's a wide variety of royalty rates, really depends on the market conditions for when the lease is signed. State land, many states have transitioned from 12.5% royalty to 16.67% royalty. That happened a lot of that happened during the shale boom in the late 2000s and 2010s. For federal land, there's also been a shift from 12.5% to 16.67%, but that's actually happened more recently as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay. So overall, you can see that it's complicated to disentangle all of these different pieces. Okay. And in particular, another thing that I think is interesting is it's not obvious from looking at this which kind of land regime, whether federal, state, or private, is actually the easiest for an operator to go about drilling and producing. Finally, a third reason why it's really hard to disentangle the impact of permitting itself is simply that we just don't have great information about permitting in oil and gas. So the Bureau of Land Management's administrative database for tracking permits is called the Automated Fluid Minerals Support System. Unlike some other government databases, this is not made publicly available. So we just have very little information about things like, hey, how quickly are these applications approved? What fraction fail or are withdrawn by the operator? Why do they fail? How much does administrative overload say because you have lots of applications coming in? How much does that delay approval of any given application? And we don't even really know a great deal on, do operators actually use these permits to drill? So Government Accountability Office has done some great work on this. However, we don't have much that actually ties what they have done, looking at this automated fluid mineral support system, tying that with the eventual oil and gas development outcomes. So, however, I have done some work thinking about this. I see in my slides I have a slightly different format, so I apologize about the words that are single words that are spanning multiple lines. And so I've done some work on this in Wyoming. So here's a stylized diagram of land ownership patterns in Wyoming. And Wyoming is a nice place to look at because it's relatively undeveloped in other ways, at least in this western part. And so you can really just focus on, hey, has oil and gas drilling and production happened or not? Another thing that's really nice about it is that there's a regular pattern of land ownership in that simply from very old rules from the 17 and 1800s, there were rules put into place about that the state governments would have ownership of specific square mile sections of land. Particularly in Wyoming, we have these isolated islands of state land, which I've colored in pink, which are owned by the state, versus white, which you can think of as federal government. And these land ownership patterns have remained robust. If you look at this, you might say, hey, this is a great setting to get a sense of the impact of overall federal versus state regulations. And when I look at this, I find that on that state land, 27% of those square mile sections have had drilling, whereas on those federal white square mile sections of land, only 22%. So that might suggest, hey, there is an impact of regulation. However, there's some more details. So the devil is in the details, right? So one of the other things we can look at and say is, well, you know what? Proximity to state land might actually matter. So here I've got the same picture, But now I've added a new color, this gray color, which is for those square mile sections of land that are particularly far from state land. So now we can compare white federal land that is close to state land, pink state land itself, as well as that gray federal land that's far away. And here we actually see some differences in whether there has been any drilling. So state land, of course, is 27%, but now there's a difference between that federal land that's close and that federal land that's far. The federal land that's far away has actually 25% probability of having a well. So that gap has been narrowed if we just compare the pink and the gray versus comparing the white and the gray. Excuse me, instead of just comparing the white and the pink. Okay, and so what is going on? Well, it really seems to be operators thinking about land being substitutes. So if you think that there's some oil potentially under the ground and you want to drill an initial exploratory well, you could drill it on state land or you could drill it on nearby federal land if you think that that pool of oil is sort of in the vicinity of that state land, right? So you drill that initial exploratory well for whatever reason you drill on state land, you say, you know what? I found that either there's nothing or maybe it's a low productivity well. I might not be willing to actually drill on that nearby federal land. It's only the case if it's really productive that you say, oh, this is a great place. I've got a good initial exploratory well. I'd like to drill some follow-up wells on that nearby federal land. Contrast that to the setting where you might think there's an oil and gas field in the vicinity of that gray land. Well, there you don't have any state land to drill on. And so you're going to drill an initial exploratory well somewhere on federal land. So as a result, we get these spatial spillovers where, for whatever reason, firms are preferring to drill on state land, which decreases drilling on nearby federal land, but not so much that federal land that's far away. One implication of all of this is that even small differences in regulation, when coupled with spatial proximity and these spillover effects, can lead to big differences in drilling outcomes. Another implication is that simply comparing overall outcomes for federal versus state land can overstate the impacts of policy. So finally, I'm going to show you one last graph, which is thinking about the rollout of drilling over time. And this is where we get to some kind of suggestive evidence about the impact of permitting. So here I've got basically the probability that there's been any well drilled on a given square mile section of land by any given date for this part of Wyoming. And you can see I've got 3 different lines. One is for the state land, one is for the federal land that is close to state land, so that white in the previous slide. And then the final is the federal land that's far from state land, that was previously the gray in the previous slide. Okay? And you can see that the 3 lines actually have really similar trends until about the 1980s. In the 1980s, there's a divergence, and this happens shortly after NEPA and the Endangered Species Act are passed, which then affect the approval process for the applications for the permit to drill. So that's where we start to see this divergence, which suggests that potentially NEPA and other similar regulations are starting to drive that divergence. But the thing that's interesting here is that divergence is only happening for that federal land that's close to state land. We're not actually seeing a decrease in drilling for that federal land that's far away. And so that suggests that if there is a regulatory impact, that seems to be happening through this spatial spillover effect, but not necessarily having this aggregate impact. And so this is really kind of a big question. Heidi brought up the question of, hey, how much is permitting keeping projects from being developed? Well, this suggests that maybe the process for applications for permit to drill approval is maybe simply shuffling where that drilling happens, but not necessarily shifting the total amount of drilling. Finally, we can think about what was the actual production. When we look at this, we find that it's actually the case that state land, federal land that's close to state land, and federal land that's far from state land all have similar probabilities of having highly productive oil and gas. The gap that seems to happen is really being driven by low productivity places. So you might drill that initial exploratory well on state land and say, well, it's worth producing from this well, but it's not worth drilling an additional follow-up well. So the impact really seems to be happening in these lower productivity, these sort of marginal areas. So I'll close there and turn the time to Zach.
Great.
Great. Delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk about permitting and infrastructure costs, focusing mostly on transportation infrastructure. So I started working on this when I was a PhD student in economics at Berkeley, and California high-speed rail was, in its earlier years, and things were not looking so good, and they've only gotten a lot worse since then. Initial cost estimates that we could, build it in a relatively short amount of time for like $20 billion, and now it's over $100 billion. And will ever be built? Who knows? It's clear that what's going on here is not just permitting. There are also issues of just not having nearly enough staffers to actually manage the project, getting taken for a ride by consultants. But a lot of it also is permitting. Any of these landowners can sue and slow things down a lot and demand expensive structures, often elevated structures, so that their farms aren't split up, and it's just has dramatically driven up costs. Previous, this translation has messed up some of the spacing here. As you saw, discussed a lot in the previous session. Big issue is we're not building electricity transmission nearly quickly enough, and need to build like huge amounts of it, and we're building basically none of it each year. So we're never going to have a green transition. Again, clearly this is not just permitting; it's also state and local regulations. Like a lot of these guys are monopolists who don't want competition from out of state. So we need different types of. We actually need more regulation, not less regulation in some cases, but it's also permitting. If you need 50 different permitters to permit these things, like they're just never going to get built at a reasonable speed. So here is the cost of building urban transit across countries. The US is in red. As you can see, it's one of the highest per kilometer in the world. When you adjust for how little tunneling the US does, the US is arguably the highest in the world. One reason to think that legal institutions have something to do with what's going on here is that if you look at the Anglo countries, there are 5 Anglo countries here, they're all toward the top. And so that's one reason to think that whatever else is going on, there's something about our laws that might be driving this. One reason to think that, one thing that's particularly striking about the US is that we were not always this way. We've had a big change in the cost of building infrastructure. So here we look at the cost of building highways over time per mile. This is from the rollout of the interstate program. So in the 1960s, it cost about $8.5 million per mile to build an interstate mile. It was pretty flat throughout the 1960s, and then around 1970, when NEPA passed, and lots of other things happened too, costs started really skyrocketing. So that by the 1980s, costs were about 3 times as high as they were in the 1980s, and then as the 1960s, and then costs continued going up after that. As you can see here, we have materials prices, like those are flat. Like the price of materials explains none of this, essentially. Instead, what seems to happen is the structures got more expensive. We built more sound walls. We built below ground to be less disruptive. Highways got windier, perhaps to avoid interactions with recalcitrant landowners. One thing that's particularly notable about the results is that if you look before 1970, there was no relationship between how rich a place was and how much its highways cost. After 1970, there was a very strong relationship. Richer places got more expensive highways. Now that might be a sensible thing if you think rich people should have more expensive highways, but one interpretation of what happened is that rich people were better able to leverage the legal changes, both in statutes like NEPA, as well as institutional changes in Congress, in the courts, like were discussed previously, as well as just changes in our social organizations. Lots of groups were founded, and maybe especially rich groups were best able to leverage these kind of complicated legal maneuvers to slow these things down and drive up the costs. Final reason to think that kind of legal rules have something to do with this increase in cost is that statistically, if you look across space, 1/4 of this increase is statistically explained by increases in land use cases over time. So I just showed you, I can kind of combine the previous two slides looking over countries and over time. And you can look at the US highways this way as well. The highways that we've built over the last 20 years are just kind of wildly more expensive than any other highway that I can find anywhere else in the world. The data here are fairly sparse, but it's you know, the magnitudes here are gigantic. So something pretty substantial is going on here. And if you talk to people, it seems clear that permitting is a big piece of the story. How do we get here? In the previous session talked about the natural environment. I want to talk about the urban environment some too. So I live in New Haven. In the 1960s, New Haven's downtown was basically knocked down. And with the plan of building a highway. This was tremendously disruptive. These were low-income communities. They were targeted because they were low-income communities. This is also extremely expensive. Like, it's very expensive to knock down a bunch of perfectly fine buildings and then build a bunch of new and notably very ugly buildings to replace them. And almost no one thinks this is a good idea now. And this helped generate the backlash that led to NEPA and similar statutes. And we don't do stuff like this anymore. And that is good. Even well after these things were passed, the time that's taken to do an environmental impact statement, which is the highest level it's done under NEPA, has increased. In the late 90s, it took about 3.25 years to do an environmental impact statement. We're now at the beginning of the Biden administration, we're up to about 5 or 4.75 years. That latest dot is a little lower. That could be because of increased funding for permitting staffing and the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. But in any case, it takes a lot of time. And the environmental impact statements are after there's already been a substantial amount of planning and before there's any litigation, which in turn is before there's any construction. So this is just a lot of time to be delaying projects. These statements have increased a lot in their length, page length over time. I collected some data in the late 70s. In the late 70s, they were about 400 pages on average. Now they're about 1,700 pages on average. And the reason might be the litigation. Anytime a court brings up something, like you need to include that thing in it, and the court brings up another thing, and then you need to include that thing in it, the things just get longer and longer over time, and that's maybe part of why these things get so long. Lawsuits are pretty time-consuming too. When a litigant succeeds on at least one thing, it takes 2.5 years. Even when when the project opponents fail on everything, it still takes 1.5 years, which is substantial. There are maybe deep differences with the U.S., between the U.S. and other countries that relate to this. If you look at U.S. versus not tiny European countries, the U.S. is the most lawyers per capita other than Italy, and that could be cause or reflection of some of what we're seeing. So I've been talking mostly about costs. Brief point about benefits. There's just not tons of great data on this. One area in which you might have seen a benefit of NEPA, at least if you're an environmentalist, is that you might have seen a reduction in the rate that we built natural gas pipelines. There was no such thing after NEPA passed, but data are sparse, and furthermore, we don't know what would have happened in the absence of this. Maybe there would have been an even faster increase in the absence of NEPA, and obviously some people don't consider, it's obviously contestable whether this is a cost or benefit in the first place. So here's how I think about NEPA and permitting in terms of the benefits and costs of permitting itself. So benefits, often harder to measure. Something that folks haven't talked much about here, but many people think there are important procedural benefits to environmental review. It's important, many people think, to have voices heard, their voices heard as a matter of democratic processes. There have been many environmental improvements after the Environmental Acts passed, after the circa 1970 huge improvements in air quality, water quality. Less clear how much of that happened to do with NEPA, and now, as the earlier panel was describing, now we need to build a lot in order to improve the environments, making the impacts of NEPA even less clear on the environment. And finally, a benefit might be distributional. Like I said before, for highways, it's actually the richer places that got more expensive highways, but there is excellent research on how many poorer communities, in terms of the most severe kind of knockdown things, like I showed you before with New Haven, many lower income communities did disproportionately benefit from this. So the kind of the worst abuses kind of do seem to have been stopped in significant part, I think, because of NEPA and similar statutes. I should note as well on the distributional aspects of NEPA and how the rich are able to weaponize it. I think the best writing on this is by Jerusalem Dimsas, who's sitting in the back. So I commend her writing to you on that. In terms of costs, economic costs, so I think at just a high level, we're often going to have slower and more expensive construction because you have the long litigation. Sometimes there are going to be agreements as part of litigation or as part of environmental review to make changes, but often the changes are going to be defensive. In anticipation of the litigation, you make the projects more expensive. You are less disruptive to land. You take more expensive routes, and that's going to tend to lower productivity if we're spending a lot more on things. Taking a couple examples on infrastructure, for transportation, we're going to tend to have less of it. So people are going to have longer commute times. There's going to be worse matching to jobs. So people are going to be less productive in their jobs. We're going to have higher costs of moving goods. And if people are spending more time commuting, they're going to maybe be working fewer hours because of the time that they spent commuting. For electrical infrastructure, if we're not able to connect these very cheap wind and solar, electricity is going to be more expensive. Also probably more carbon intensive, and that's a hit to productivity. We also, with previous caveats noted, kind of might have less mining, in housing. We have similar issues as well. So in short, costs and benefits are hard to weigh, in large part because we just don't have a tremendously great evidence base. At the same time, I agree with the thrust of the previous panel that on net, especially given that we need to build a lot to make the green transition, some changes seem worth making, but a lot of would be great to have a lot more empirical analysis, and I'm grateful for the work that CBO is doing to improve our analysis on this.
As all three of them can attest, I have infinitely many questions that I could ask, but maybe given the time, why don't we just take one or two questions from the audience if people have them? Yeah.
Hi, Nikiforos Meletiadis, Charles River Associates. I have a question towards Dr. Lisko. With respect to the cost of the highways, what do you believe or what do you know about the impact that the introduction of new types of transportation models like public-private partnerships had towards these rising costs that you mentioned? For example, in the 1990s, we have the ISTA legislation, which liberalized and allowed states to experiment much more with this type of contracts. And also, whether in these costs, we also take into account the different things that were being bought by the public. For example, in public-private partnerships, there is also a lot of risk that is being bought by the public. These are my questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. So with respect to the build-out of the interstate highways, which were mostly built by the early 90s, I think public-private partnerships were not such a big deal. The model was basically the feds funded 90% plus a little more in some cases, and the state departments of transportation built them with private contractors. And the way they did that was typically we're going to pay you for each unit of stuff that you built and each unit of labor that you use. So if you use more labor and have more concrete because you're building walls above ground, maybe below ground, then it's going to end up costing a lot more. Subsequent to that, these huge debates and procurement. My overall sense is that whether it's public-private partnership or something else, is less important than having adequate state capacity. You need to have adequate people in government to manage whatever the private contractors are doing. All these things are done primarily, overwhelmingly, by the private sector. The public sector is basically not building any of this stuff. And what's most important is that, unlike in the case of California high-speed rail, where there were like a dozen people that were supposed to manage this many billion-dollar project at the beginning, which is part of why it went off the rails. You need to have adequate. You need to have adequate capacity to do it well. And there's many models across many countries, including in Europe, and they often go fine, but a lot of what depends upon is if you have enough people in government to do it well. This relates to permitting as well. It's like a lot of why, especially this is at least the thesis of the Biden administration. I don't know how right they are or not, but how they were, right they were or not. But their thesis is a part of why this is so slow is that there just literally were not enough permitters in the federal government and in states to make this go quickly enough. I don't know how true that is. They think they say they sped it up by hiring more. And obviously that didn't get us below 4 years. So maybe that still isn't enough, but I think that there is a state capacity and access as well with permitting directly.
Great. Yep.
Thank you very much for your time today. My name is Joe Michalowski. I'm legislative aide to State Representative Levi Dean from the Dayton area, and he's a member of the House Development Committee. So I have a two-part question. So the phrase "time is money" is relevant, and in Ohio we have been on the front lines of the natural gas boom that you referenced. Have any developers been successful in recovering compensation associated with failed litigation or policies intended to delay or cancel their project? And then secondly, have there been any similar habitat or terrain considerations that have been able to expedite permitting or otherwise helpful to projects such as the ones you discussed? Thank you.
I don't know whether any of our panelists would like to speak to those, but if not, I don't know if anybody on the previous panel would have examples they would like to share on that, or no. Those are both great questions. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and I know we're running just a few minutes over. But if I can, so let me just close by saying, just briefly, can you each give a sense of kind of like one thing that you think is an important constraint on our understanding of how permitting affects the economy? So Eric, for example, brought up this Bureau of Land Management administrative data. Other agencies like the National Institutes of Health bring in outside researchers to partner with agency staff and do research that's relevant to the agency. And so I don't want to answer for you, but that would be kind of an example. Or Joe, I know that CBO has a wish list of parameters that we wish we had more certainty about. But maybe we can close by just each of you highlighting kind of one area of uncertainty where you feel like more information would be especially beneficial.
Sure. Yes, we do have a wish list. Perhaps at the top of that list is what would changes in permitting or changes in energy do to private investment? So in trying to understand the effects of legislation on the budget and the economy, what's really important is trying to set up this counterfactual that Heidi mentioned at the beginning of what would happen if a particular bill were enacted. So trying to get a better understanding of the amount of private activity, the amount of private investment that would occur if a law were to be changed, I think is really important. So understanding how different regulatory regimes across states or across time have affected the amount of private investment would probably be pretty high on my wish list.
Yeah. Eric?
Yeah. Having a better understanding of exactly what's happening with the Bureau of Land Management application for permit to drill approvals. There's just no transparency on that. So that I think would be incredibly interesting and important to understand. I guess one caveat is, one takeaway from I think what I've found, at least in Wyoming, is that we're not seeing the massive impacts that we're seeing, say, for pipelines or transmission lines. Right? The impacts seem to be on these very low productivity kinds of places, and so I think we might be much more concerned about permitting issues with pipelines and transmission.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to untangle kind of what exactly has driven this tremendous increase in the cost of building infrastructure over time. A lot of things changed in 1970. NEPA itself has many different pieces. We discussed before. A dozen different reforms. Like, what exactly are the main drivers here? How much is permitting? How much is other stuff? Would be these are very hard empirical questions, but that's a lot of what animates my questions on this subject.
Great. Let me just thank Michael and AEI again for hosting, and I think we'll call that a day. Thanks.